The river has changed its course, the forest has thickened, and the grasslands that once opened across central Java are closing beneath wetter skies. Along the Solo River, where sediment gathers in terraces above the water, a small population of ancient humans leaves behind the last dated trace of one of the longest-lived human lineages on Earth. Their skulls are thick, their brows heavy, and their brains larger than those of their earliest relatives. Yet their faces still belong to a humanity different from our own. They survive here between roughly 117,000 and 108,000 years ago, nearly 2 million years after their lineage first appeared. Then the record falls silent. No battlefield marks their end. No volcanic layer seals their fate. There is only a fading population beside a changing river, followed by absence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. It is tempting to imagine these people as the final members of one unbroken species marching through time, from Africa to Georgia, through China and Southeast Asia. But that picture is too neat. Homo erectus was never one fixed shape. Across nearly 2 million years, fossils assigned to this name vary sharply in brain size, facial form, teeth, body proportions, and skull architecture. Some researchers separate the African fossils as Homo ergaster and reserve Homo erectus for Asian populations. Others see regional forms of one widespread species. Still others suspect that the label covers several related populations blurred by a sparse fossil record, and evolution ignores the tidy boxes later scientists create. The disagreement is not a side issue. It is the heart of the story. The Ngandong skulls belong to the late Asian end of that complicated lineage. 12 partial skull caps and 2 shin bones were recovered from deposits associated with an ancient terrace of the Solo River. Their age was disputed for decades, because the fossils predated modern dating methods and rivers rearranged the past. A multidisciplinary study eventually placed the fossil-bearing layer between about 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. That range makes Ngandong the youngest securely dated population currently assigned to Homo erectus. It does not reveal the exact moment of extinction. A population may have survived elsewhere without leaving remains that have been found. Yet Ngandong is the last place where the species, however broadly defined, stands clearly before the evidence disappears. This setting matters because extinction rarely happens in empty space. Late Pleistocene Java is not a stable tropical island waiting unchanged through the ages. Sea levels rise and fall. River systems reorganize. Volcanic landscapes are rebuilt. During colder periods, Java joins exposed Sundaland, connecting with mainland Southeast Asia across rivered lowlands. On exposed banks, deer, bovids, and elephants move through a landscape that no longer exists above the sea. During warmer periods, the sea advances and fragments that world. Vegetation shifts as rainfall changes. Open woodland can give way to denser forest. Large mammals move, decline, or vanish from familiar ranges. A population adapted to riverbanks, open ground, and woodland margins may find the same valley transformed within a geological instant. At Ngandong, the late Homo erectus population appears near the end of a long ecological regime. The surrounding fauna suggests open woodland and grassland conditions, landscapes in which these humans had persisted for an extraordinary span. Later evidence points toward increasing humidity and expanding rainforest in parts of the region. This has encouraged the idea that ecological change helped bring about their disappearance. But correlation is not proof. Rainforest did not arrive like a wall and erase them. Changes in vegetation would have altered prey, travel routes, visibility, plant foods, and river corridors. Small populations could have become more isolated. Familiar strategies may have worked less often. Several pressures, each survivable alone, may have combined until recovery became impossible. Other humans may also have been moving through wider Asia. Denisovan-related populations, other archaic groups, and early Homo sapiens occupied or crossed parts of the continent at different times. Yet there is no evidence that modern humans reached Ngandong and killed the last Homo erectus there. No archaeological layer shows conquest, competition, displacement, or limited interbreeding remain possible, but none can be demonstrated at this river terrace. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the silence that follows. That silence feels strange because Homo erectus had survived almost everything the Pleistocene could produce. Populations associated with this broad lineage endured shifting climates, unfamiliar predators, changing coastlines, eruptions, and movements into new habitats. They occupied parts of Africa, the Caucasus, East Asia, and island Southeast Asia. They lived with relatively small brains at Dmanisi and with much larger ones in later populations. They used simple flake tools in some places and carefully shaped cutting tools in others. They exploited dry landscapes, river valleys, lake margins, forests, and open plains. Some may have used or maintained fire. Others crossed barriers that would have stopped earlier hominins. Their record is not one of fragile failure. It is one of astonishing persistence. Yet persistence can hide vulnerability. A lineage may endure for immense spans while existing in scattered populations, each dependent on local conditions and capable of disappearing without affecting distant relatives. What looks like one species lasting nearly 2 million years may be a sequence of regional experiments, some merging into later populations, some changing beyond recognition, and some ending completely. In Africa, descendants of erectus-like populations may have contributed to later Middle Pleistocene Homo. In Asia, relationships remain harder to reconstruct. Ancient enamel proteins from Chinese Homo erectus have opened the possibility of connections with Denisovans, but they have not produced a complete genome or a simple family tree. Even molecular evidence arrives in fragments. So the mystery at Ngandong is larger than the disappearance of one group. It asks what it means for a human lineage to end. Did Java populations decline as the climate remade their world? Were they absorbed into other archaic populations, leaving traces too faint to identify? Did isolation reduce them beyond recovery? Or did several regional lineages bearing the same name meet different fates at different times? The fossils do not answer. They only mark the final secure appearance. The Solo River keeps moving. Sediment covers bone, then releases it more than 100,000 years later. The skullcaps emerge without faces, voices, or explanations for their last days. They tell us that Homo erectus remained in Java until astonishingly late. They also warn that the final chapter of a species is rarely preserved as a clear ending. To understand why these people vanished, the story must move backward from this last river, across changing islands and vanished plains, toward the first bones that forced the modern world to recognize that humanity had once taken more than one form. The journey backward begins not in Africa, where the earliest members of the lineage probably emerged, but on a riverbank in Java during the late 19th century, when one determined anatomist went looking for a creature many scientists were not yet sure had existed. Eugène Dubois was a Dutch physician with an unusually specific ambition. He believed that fossil evidence of an intermediate human form might be found in the tropics, and he was willing to abandon a conventional medical career to search for it. His reasoning mixed evolutionary ideas with assumptions that now seem narrow or mistaken, yet his expedition produced one of the most consequential discoveries in the history of human origins. Dubois first went to Sumatra, then shifted his efforts to Java, where military labourers excavated deposits along the Solo River near the village of Trinil. The work was difficult, repetitive, and often unrewarding. Sediment had to be moved in enormous quantities, while animal fossils emerged far more often than anything human. Then, in 1891, a thick skull cap appeared. The following year, a femur was recovered nearby. A molar was also associated with the finds. Dubois believed these remains belonged to one ancient individual that combined an ape-like skull with a human-like ability to walk upright. He named it Pithecanthropus erectus, the upright ape human. The name carried the argument inside it. Dubois was not merely cataloguing bones. He was claiming to have found a transitional form predicted by evolutionary theory. The skull cap had a low vault, heavy brow ridge, and brain size below that of most living humans. The femur looked strikingly human and suggested efficient bipedal movement. Together, they seemed to bridge categories many scholars still treated as separate. But the association was never as simple as the public story later implied. The skullcap and femur were found at different times and not in direct anatomical connection. Their relationship was debated, and later discoveries showed that the Trinil deposits contained a complex mixture of remains accumulated in a dynamic river environment. Even so, the skullcap itself could not be dismissed. It was clearly ancient and unlike any recent human population. Some researchers saw it as a giant gibbon. Others regarded it as a pathological modern human. A few accepted that it represented an extinct human form but disagreed over where it belonged. The resistance was partly anatomical, partly philosophical, and partly personal. Dubois defended his interpretation with increasing intensity, while critics challenged both his conclusions and his control over access to the fossils. Over time, the debate hardened into a legend in which a misunderstood discoverer hid his evidence from the world. The reality was more complicated. Dubois did restrict study at periods, but he also published, displayed casts, and continued arguing for the find's significance. His relationship with the scientific community became strained because the fossil fit no one's expectations, including his own. The argument became a struggle over what kind of creature could properly be called human. Later discoveries transformed the argument. In the 1930s, new skulls and fragments from Java revealed that Trinil was not an isolated curiosity. Similar remains appeared at Sangaran and elsewhere. In China, fossils once called Sinanthropus pekinensis, or Peking man, showed comparable heavy brows, low skulls, and robust cranial walls. As the record grew, researchers increasingly recognized that these forms belonged within the genus Homo, rather than in a separate ape-human genus. Pithecanthropus erectus was eventually absorbed into Homo erectus. The change did not erase Dubois' discovery. It placed it inside a wider and far more complex lineage. Yet even the modern name creates a misleading sense of unity. The Trinil skullcap, later Javanese fossils, Chinese specimens, African remains often called Homo ergaster, and the small-brained hominins from Dmanisi do not all look the same. Cranial thickness, brow shape, brain size, facial proportions, and dental anatomy shift across geography and time. Some specialists argue that the Asian fossils form Homo erectus in a strict sense, while African fossils should be separated as Homo ergaster. Others emphasize shared anatomy and continuity across a wide-ranging species. What survives in the record suggests extraordinary regional variation, but scholars still debate where variation ends and separate species begin. The naming history matters because labels can quietly turn uncertainty into apparent fact. When a fossil is placed under Homo erectus, it may seem to join a single biological population stretching from Africa to Indonesia for nearly 2 million years. No such continuous population existed. There were separated groups, changing environments, repeated dispersals, and long intervals for local evolution. The name is useful because it gathers related evidence. It is dangerous when it encourages the image of one stable human type walking unchanged across continents. Trinil adds another layer of difficulty. The landscape Dubois excavated was part of an ancient river system, and the fossils were not preserved as a complete burial or frozen moment. Bones could be transported, scattered, and redeposited. The famous femur has therefore remained controversial in relation to the skull cap. Some researchers have questioned whether it belongs to the same taxon or geological context. The evidence supports upright walking among Homo erectus, but that conclusion now rests on a broader fossil record, not on a perfect association between two bones from Trinil. Dubois had imagined that one discovery might reveal the missing form between ape and human. Instead, he opened a door onto a branching landscape. The fossils did not produce a clean chain. They revealed that ancient humanity had included forms with combinations of traits that no longer exist. A human-like leg could coexist with a low, elongated skull. Brain size could increase without producing a modern face. Similar body plans could appear among populations whose exact relationships remain unresolved. The lesser-known irony is that the original name survived in spirit even after its genus changed. The species word erectus, emphasizing upright posture, remained attached to a lineage whose members were not the first bipeds. Upright locomotion had evolved millions of years earlier. The name persists because scientific history leaves its own fossils, labels deposited by earlier debates and carried forward after the original assumptions have changed. From the river at Trinil, the human past became permanently more crowded. The skull cap forced researchers to accept that Asia had preserved deep chapters of human evolution, and that extinct humans could not be reduced to crude versions of ourselves. But it also established a problem that still shapes every discussion of Homo erectus, whether bones from distant places and different ages belong to one remarkably variable species, several related species, or a shifting evolutionary grade modern taxonomy cannot neatly contain. The answer must be sought earlier than Java, in landscapes where multiple human forms lived side by side, and where the first erectus-like anatomy began to emerge from a much older and less orderly world. 2 million years before the last skulls rested beside the Solo River, Africa held no single humanity waiting to become modern. It held a crowded experiment. In the south, robust-jawed Paranthropus fed with enormous chewing muscles and broad teeth. Other hominins retained smaller bodies and more ancient proportions. Early members of Homo occupied overlapping landscapes, some known only from jaws, teeth, or partial crania that refused to fit cleanly into later categories. In this world, Homo erectus does not arrive like a replacement actor stepping onto an empty stage. Its earliest traits appear among neighbours, rivals, and possible relatives, while several kinds of human continue living at the same time. Dmanisi in South Africa preserves this complexity with unusual force. The site lies within a region of caves and fossil deposits sometimes called the cradle of humankind, though the phrase can suggest a single birthplace where none has been proved. Around 2 million years ago, the landscape consisted of open and wooded habitats broken by water sources, limestone features, and shifting patches of vegetation. Animals moved through it, and so did multiple hominin populations. Among the fossils recovered there is a partial skull known as DNH, 134 dated to roughly 2.04 to 1.95 million years ago. It has often been identified as one of the earliest known representatives of Homo erectus. That identification is important, but not final. The fossil is small, and its preserved anatomy does not resolve every question. Some specialists accept it as early Homo erectus. Others remain cautious about both its classification and the precision of the dating. The disagreement is exactly what an origin story should contain. Species do not appear at a single moment with every later feature already assembled. Fossils near the beginning of a lineage often carry mixtures of old and new anatomy, and the categories created from younger specimens may fit them poorly. At Drimmelin, DNH 134 shares the broader landscape with Paranthropus robustus and Australopithecus sediba. Their coexistence overturns the old ladder-like picture of evolution, in which one form disappears before a more advanced form replaces it. There was no orderly procession. Different hominins could occupy the same region, use different foods, move through similar terrain, and respond in distinct ways to climatic instability. They may never have met face to face, and the fossils do not reveal whether they competed directly. But they were close enough in time and space to belong to the same ecological drama. The same pattern appears elsewhere in Eastern Africa, around the period when erectus-like anatomy becomes visible. Fossils assigned to Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and other early Homo forms remain present or difficult to distinguish. Their brains vary, their faces vary, their teeth and jaws preserve combinations that do not arrange themselves into a simple sequence. Homo habilis is often portrayed as the immediate predecessor of Homo erectus, but the two may have overlapped for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo rudolfensis, known from a limited and disputed collection, adds another possible branch, depending on which fossils are included and how they are interpreted. Early Homo looks either moderately diverse or astonishingly crowded. The common view still places the origin of Homo erectus in Africa, probably near 2 million years ago. That model is supported by the age of African fossils and by the broader sequence of earlier hominin evolution on the continent. Yet the exact population in which the defining anatomy first emerged remains uncertain. The boundary between Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, African Homo ergaster, and Homo erectus is blurred by incomplete preservation and by the possibility that traits evolved at different rates in different groups. A long-legged body, a larger brain, a more projecting nose, reduced teeth, and the characteristic shape of the skull need not have appeared together. A skull from Gona, Ethiopia, known as Dan 5P1, makes this mosaic especially visible, dated to around 1.6 to 1.5 million years ago. It is younger than the earliest proposed erectus fossils, yet it retains a surprisingly small brain and a face with primitive features while also displaying anatomy associated with Homo erectus. A reconstruction published in late 2025 strengthened the impression that erectus was not born through one sudden transformation. Instead, populations may have acquired different parts of the later pattern in stages. Some features could have spread through contact and interbreeding between neighboring groups. Others may have evolved independently under similar pressures. The evidence remains incomplete. but a patchwork process fits the fossils better than a clean evolutionary leap. This does not mean Homo erectus evolved separately everywhere. The strongest overall model still favors an African origin followed by dispersal, but even within Africa, that origin may have involved a network of populations rather than one isolated birthplace. Rivers expanded and contracted, grasslands opened, then fragmented, woodland corridors shifted, groups separated for generations and later came back into contact. Small anatomical differences could accumulate, disappear, or move between populations. Evolution in such a world would resemble braided channels more than a straight river. Climate contributed to the instability without dictating a single outcome. Near the beginning of the Pleistocene, global cooling intensified, while African environments changed in uneven pulses. Open habitats became more widespread in some regions, but forests did not simply vanish. The result was a mosaic of grassland, bush, woodland, lakeshore, and river margin. Hominins capable of moving flexibly between these zones may have gained advantages, yet specialization also remained successful. Paranthropus endured for more than 1 million years after Erectus appeared. Survival was not a contest won immediately by the form most similar to us. The fossils at Dmanisi contain a quieter warning about how easily later observers impose hierarchy. Because Homo erectus eventually spread farther and persisted longer than its neighbours, it can appear destined for success. Nothing in the landscape would have made that destiny visible. A small-brained erectus individual would not have seemed obviously superior to a robust Paranthropus or another early Homo. Each lineage carried adaptations shaped by its own history. The future belonged not to an abstract level of advancement, but to populations that could continue reproducing as habitats, foods, and routes changed around them. What survives from this beginning is therefore not a birth certificate for a species. It is a series of overlapping forms, scattered across deposits and separated by missing generations. They show that the lineage later called Homo erectus emerged from diversity and remained diverse. Its first chapter is not the triumph of one human type, but the moment when several ancient human possibilities shared the same continent, and one of them began, slowly and unevenly, to acquire the body and adaptability that would carry its descendants far beyond Africa. Long before that expansion became visible, however, the essential transformation was already underway within Africa's crowded, unstable, and deeply interconnected evolutionary landscape. The change first becomes unmistakable below the neck. Earlier hominins could walk upright, but many still carried proportions suited to both the ground and the trees. In Homo erectus, especially among African fossils often called Homo ergaster, the body begins to look more familiar, legs lengthen, arms become relatively shorter. The chest, pelvis, feet, and stride suggest a creature committed to terrestrial travel over distances that would have reshaped daily life. This was not the first biped, and it was not yet a modern human in every detail, but it possessed a body that made the wider world more reachable. The most famous evidence comes from a nearly complete skeleton found west of Lake Turkana in Kenya. Catalogued as KNM-WT 15,000 and commonly known as Turkana boy, the individual lived roughly 1.5 to 1.6 million years ago. He was not an adult, despite the old habit of imagining him as fully grown. Dental and skeletal evidence shows that he was still developing, and estimates of his age depend on whether his growth followed a more human-like or more ape-like schedule. His surviving bones nevertheless provide a rare view of an early Homo body, far more complete than the isolated skulls and jaws that dominate the record. Turkana boy had long legs, comparatively short arms, and a tall, narrow frame. These proportions resemble those of people adapted to moving efficiently across open ground. Longer lower limbs increase stride length and can reduce the energetic cost of walking. A relatively slender body also presents more surface area for releasing heat, useful in hot climates where overheating can become as dangerous as exhaustion. The anatomy does not prove that every Homo erectus population was tall or lightly built. Fossils from different regions show substantial variation, and some later Asian groups may have been more compact. But the African skeleton demonstrates that a near-modern pattern of limb proportions had emerged early. This mattered because distance changes the scale of survival. A small-bodied hominin tied closely to woodland must find food, water, shelter, and mates within a restricted range. A long-legged walker can connect resources that lie farther apart. It can follow seasonal rivers, move between lake margins and grasslands, carry stone or food, and leave a depleted area before local scarcity becomes fatal. Mobility does not guarantee success, but it creates options. In unstable environments, options are often the difference between persistence and disappearance. The feet also point toward committed terrestrial movement. Homo erectus likely possessed a longitudinal arch and a stiffened midfoot capable of pushing the body forward efficiently. Though the fossil record is incomplete, tracks from sites such as Ilori in Kenya, dated to around 1.5 million years ago, show hominins with an essentially human-like footfall, a heel strike, weight transfer along the outer foot, and push-off through the big toe. Some trackways are commonly attributed to Homo erectus because of their age and form, but footprints rarely carry a species label with certainty. What they reveal most securely is that at least one large-bodied Homo population moved through the landscape with a gait broadly similar to ours. The body was not simply a set of long limbs. The pelvis had to balance childbirth, walking efficiency, and the support of internal organs. The spine had to stabilize a tall trunk, the shoulders and arms, although shorter relative to the legs than in earlier hominins, remained powerful. Hands could grip stone cores, strike flakes, butcher carcasses, dig, carry, and manipulate materials that almost never fossilize. A body adapted for distance still had to perform the repetitive work of everyday survival. Researchers have often linked this anatomy to endurance running. Humans are unusual primates in their ability to travel long distances at moderate speed, aided by sweating, elastic tendons, foot arches, and head stabilization. Some of these features may have roots in Homo erectus, and the long-legged body could have supported running. Yet the popular image of hunters pursuing animals until they collapsed goes beyond what the fossils prove. Persistence hunting is one possible behavior, not a demonstrated universal strategy. Bones cannot tell us whether a group ran for hours, scavenged after predators, ambushed prey near water, or relied more heavily on plants and small animals. Heat would have shaped that movement. Open landscapes expose the body to intense sunlight, and a large brain is vulnerable to rising temperature. Modern humans cool themselves through abundant sweating and reduced body hair, but soft tissues leave little direct fossil evidence. It is reasonable to infer that Homo erectus had improved thermoregulation compared with earlier hominins, especially given its body proportions and activity levels, but the timing of major hair loss and fully human-like sweating remain uncertain. What survives in the record suggests a body increasingly capable of remaining active in hot conditions, perhaps by combining sweating, shade, water, and carefully timed travel. Turkana Boy also preserves limits. His vertebral column shows unusual features interpreted in different ways. including possible developmental abnormalities, though earlier claims about severe disease or impaired breathing have been reconsidered. The skeleton reminds us that no single individual should become the template for an entire species. He represents one young member of one African population, preserved through an extraordinary accident and recovered from a record that usually destroys bodies almost completely. Even so, his proportions illuminate why early Homo could begin crossing ecological boundaries that had contained earlier lineages. Long-distance walking would allow groups to track shifting habitats without understanding geography. They did not set out to colonize continents. They followed water, animals, edible plants, raw stone, and familiar terrain as these extended beyond the horizon. A dispersal covering thousands of kilometers could emerge from countless local decisions, each no more dramatic than moving toward the next valley. Body size itself may also have varied with nutrition, climate, sex, and population history. Some Homo erectus individuals were relatively small, others were tall. Brain size did not scale uniformly with stature, and the broad label contains combinations that resist a single reconstruction. This variation matters because the successful traveller was not one idealized body, copied across the old world. It was a flexible anatomical pattern expressed differently among separated groups. The first great expansion therefore begins not with a map or a plan, but with mechanics. A heel touches the ground. Weight rolls forward. The opposite leg swings in a long arc. Heat leaves a narrow body as the next water source comes closer. Repeated over days, seasons, and generations, that efficient stride turns local movement into evolutionary reach. Yet legs alone cannot explain where Homo erectus went or how it survived after arriving. Distance opens the landscape, but survival within it depends on memory, tools, food, cooperation, and the ability to read environments that never exactly the same twice. The skull changes more slowly than the body, and it never settles into one universal form across Africa, Georgia, China, and Indonesia. Fossils assigned to Homo erectus share a general architecture, a long, low cranial vault, strong brow ridges, thick bone, and a brain case that expands beyond that of many earlier hominins. Yet beneath those similarities lies remarkable variation. Some individuals have brains only slightly larger than those of Homo habilis. Others approach the lower range of living humans. Faces project to different degrees, teeth shrink unevenly. Brow ridges form continuous bars in some fossils, and more divided shapes in others. The mind behind the brow cannot be reconstructed from size alone, and the skull itself refuses to tell one simple story. Nor does its thickness reveal temperament. At Dmanisi, the smallest known brain volumes among the broader erectus group fall near 546 cubic centimeters, while the largest individuals from the site approach 730. These humans had already moved beyond Africa despite carrying brains much smaller than the stereotype of a successful migrant would suggest. Later fossils from Java and China often exceed 900 cubic centimeters, and some rise above 1,000. The increase is real in a broad sense, but it is not a staircase. Populations overlap, and regional histories matter. A large comparative study published in 2024 strengthened this point by showing that much of the expansion in hominin brain size may have occurred gradually within species over time, rather than through a neat sequence in which every small-brained species vanished and was replaced by a larger-brained successor. Homo erectus fits that pattern well. Its record spans so long that an early individual and a late individual can differ dramatically while still being grouped under the same name. If the label includes several closely related populations, the range becomes even less surprising. The problem is not that evolution failed to follow a straight line. The problem is that the straight line was never there. Dan5P1 from Gona, Ethiopia, captures this contradiction in one face, dating to roughly 1.6 to 1.5 million years ago. The skull displays several features associated with Homo erectus, yet its brain remained small and its facial anatomy retained primitive traits. A reconstruction published in late 2025 made the mosaic especially visible. This was not an advanced brain placed inside an ancient body, nor a primitive creature waiting to become erectus. It was a population expressing some parts of the erectus pattern while other parts followed different schedules. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive. It demands reliable energy, stable development, and extensive blood flow. But fossils cannot show exactly which cognitive abilities expanded first. A larger brain does not automatically reveal language, planning depth, empathy, symbolic thought, or technical skill. Those capacities depend on internal organization and social learning, neither of which leaves a clear imprint on cranial volume. A smaller brain can support flexible behavior, while a larger one does not guarantee modern cognition. The shape of the erectus skull may offer limited clues. The brain case is elongated rather than globular, with a low forehead and strong constriction behind the eye sockets in many specimens. The frontal and parietal regions were arranged differently from those of Homo sapiens. Endocasts, impressions of the inner skull, preserve broad surface contours and vessel patterns, but their interpretation is difficult. Researchers can identify asymmetries and general expansion, yet they cannot read thoughts from folds in stone. Claims that a particular groove proves speech or a modern mental faculty usually outrun the evidence. Still, behavior implies capacities that bones cannot display. Homo erectus population selected stone, transported it across landscapes, produced sharp edges, returned to useful places, and survived in environments ranging from semi-desert to seasonal woodland. Some groups made symmetrical Acheulean tools that required controlled sequences of strikes and an understanding of how stone would fracture. Others relied on simpler Mode 1 technologies and remained equally successful. This contrast warns against treating tool complexity as a direct measurement of intelligence. A simple flake can be exactly the right solution when raw material is abundant and the task is brief. The heavy brow ridge, one of the most recognizable erectus features, has inspired explanations involving chewing stress, skull reinforcement, facial architecture, and social signaling. No single explanation is universally accepted. It may have served several structural roles, or partly reflect how the face and brain case develop together. To modern eyes, it can make the face seem stern, but expression does not fossilize. The living face would have been covered in muscle, skin, fat, hair, and movement. A brow that appears brutal in bone may have belonged to an individual capable of subtle attention and social responsiveness. Thick cranial bone is equally easy to dramatize. Some Asian fossils have exceptionally robust vaults, once encouraging the image of a uniformly thick-skulled species. In reality, thickness varies by region, sex, age, and anatomical location. It may reflect development, body size, mechanical loading, or inherited population differences. There is no basis for turning it into a story of dullness or constant violence. Development offers another route into the hidden mind. The brain does not evolve independently of childhood. A longer period of growth allows more time for learning, but it also increases dependence on caregivers and group stability. Evidence from Dmanisi suggests that early Homo may have combined relatively rapid dental development with a somewhat prolonged schedule in later forming teeth. This pattern, examined in 2024, hints that extended human childhood emerged gradually rather than appearing all at once. The authors discussed the possibility that food sharing and social support allowed immature individuals to remain dependent for longer. But that remains an inference, not a preserved family scene. Such support would have changed cognition from the outside inward. Skills could accumulate across generations only if individuals watched, practiced, remembered, and tolerated one another long enough for knowledge to spread. A tool tradition is not stored in a single skull. It exists between people, in repeated actions and corrections. Even modest brains can produce complex outcomes when information is shared socially. The real intelligence of Homo erectus may therefore have resided partly in networks of attention, imitation, and cooperation rather than in cranial volume alone. What survives is a lineage in which brains generally grew, but unevenly, faces changed, but not in unison, and behavior often exceeded what older evolutionary schemes expected from skull size. Scholars still debate whether all these fossils belong to one species, yet their combined record shows that anatomical modernization was piecemeal. The long-legged body arrived before a truly modern brain shape. Wide dispersal occurred before very large brains. Technical flexibility did not require one standardized technology. Behind the heavy brow was not a single mind repeated for 2 million years, but many populations learning to inhabit different worlds with cognitive equipment that was itself still evolving. By the time the skull and body have taken on their more familiar proportions, the world around Homo erectus remains anything but stable. Rivers shift across floodplains. Lakes expand during wetter centuries and contract into alkaline basins during drier ones. Grasslands open where woodland once stood, then thorn, scrub, and forest return. Survival depends less on conquering one environment than on reading the boundaries between several. Water, shade, stone, plant foods, and animals gather unevenly across the land, and the most useful places are often where several resources overlap. River margins and lake shores repeatedly appear in the archaeological record because they attracted both hominins and prey. And because sediment there was more likely to bury what they left behind. These places offered drinking water, edible plants, fish, turtles, shellfish, birds, and animals forced to approach exposed banks. They also offered mud that preserved footprints and deposits that sealed bones and tools. The pattern can therefore mislead. Homo erectus was not necessarily a species of permanent waterfront camps. Many inland activities vanished without trace, while waterlogged or rapidly buried landscapes preserved a disproportionate share of the evidence. Even so, the repeated return to aquatic corridors was probably real. At Ngaji Nanyori in Oldupai Gorge, Tanzania, a record dated to around 1 million years ago reveals how deliberate that return could be. The landscape was extremely dry, more semi-desert than savanna, with scarce vegetation and water concentrated around river channels, confluences, and shallow ponds. Researchers recovered more than 22,000 stone artifacts together with numerous animal bones. Quartzite had been carried from sources roughly 2 to 13 kilometers away. Tools were made and used on site, and carcasses were processed there. This was not a single, desperate pause by travelers. The repeated activity suggests that Homo erectus understood where ecological refuges would persist when the wider landscape became hostile. The word refuge should not imply comfort. A pond in a semi-arid landscape attracts everything that needs water. Herbivores arrive, but so do large carnivores. Shade is limited. Water can become contaminated or vanish between seasons. Groups returning to such places would need timing, vigilance, and memory. They may have visited when prey was predictable, when plant foods ripened, or when distant stone sources could be reached safely. No single reconstruction is certain, yet the concentration of artifacts shows behavior organized around recurring features of the terrain rather than aimless wandering. The stone itself reveals planning on a modest but important scale. Carrying quartzite several kilometers costs energy. Individuals had to recognize the material, anticipate future tasks, and transport enough to justify the effort. Some stones may have moved in stages, passed from one activity area to another. Others could have been carried by one person over a day's travel. What survives in the record suggests a landscape known through roots, not merely seen as scenery. Food was equally varied. Cut marks and broken bones show that Homo erectus accessed animal tissue at many sites. Sharp flakes could remove flesh, open joints, and expose marrow. But the record is biased toward bones and stone. Tubers, fruits, seeds, leaves, insects, eggs, and soft aquatic foods rarely fossilize beside the tools used to obtain them. A large analysis published in 2022 found no clear, sustained increase in evidence for meat consumption immediately after Homo erectus appeared. Some of the apparent rise in carnivory may reflect heavier archaeological sampling of younger sites. The old slogan that meat made Homo erectus is therefore too simple. A flexible diet is more plausible. In open country, groups may have scavenged large carcasses, hunted smaller animals, gathered underground storage organs, and collected seasonal seeds. Along wetlands, turtles, fish, mollusks, and water plants would have added reliable calories when available. Meat and marrow were valuable because they concentrated energy, but specialization on large prey would have made populations vulnerable to every shift in animal abundance. Flexibility matched the changing environments they occupied. Freshwater resources are especially easy to underestimate. Turtles move slowly. Shellfish can be gathered without dangerous pursuit, and fish trapped in shrinking pools may become seasonally abundant. Evidence from later Javanese contexts, including the drowned landscapes of the Madura Strait, suggest processing of aquatic animals and deliberate marrow extraction. Those finds are much younger than Ngaji Nanyori, but they show that some late erectus populations could exploit river and wetland foods in ways not captured by the traditional image of hunters on open grassland. Daily life would have followed repeated practical decisions. A group reaches water before the hottest part of the day. Some individuals collect edible plants near the bank while others inspect tracks, old carcass remains, and stone left from an earlier visit. Tools are not necessarily carried as finished objects. A core can be struck when a sharp edge is needed, then abandoned because another stone source lies ahead. This routine requires no permanent settlement, only familiarity with movement. The animals around them change from region to region. In East Africa, elephants, equids, bovids, pigs, hippopotamuses, and large cats occupied overlapping habitats. In the Caucasus, early Homo moved among deer, horses, giraffids, hyenas, and saber-toothed predators. In Java, river systems supported different communities shaped by monsoon cycles and island geography. Homo erectus did not carry one African ecological package across Eurasia. Each population encountered new dangers, new prey, and unfamiliar plants. Adaptation was local even when the body plan was broadly shared. Predators were not background decoration. Lions, leopards, hyenas, and saber-toothed cats could claim carcasses and threaten isolated hominins. Accessing meat may sometimes have meant arriving after another predator had eaten, then working quickly before competitors returned. At other times, groups may have driven smaller carnivores away through numbers, stones, noise, or fire where it was available. Direct evidence for such encounters is rare, and dramatic hunting scenes often exceed what the bones can support. The safer conclusion is that Homo erectus lived inside predator communities rather than above them. The same is true of climate. These humans did not master drought or control rivers. They survived by locating places where risk could be managed. Ecological refuges offered continuity when the larger region became unstable, but dependence on them also created vulnerability. If a river changed course, a spring failed, or animal migrations shifted, remembered routes could lead to empty ground. Knowledge had to be updated continually. This repeated negotiation between opportunity and danger may explain more of Homo erectus' success than any single invention. Long legs made distance affordable. Tools made carcasses and plants more accessible. Social memory linked one resource patch to another. Yet the landscape remained the larger force, setting the terms of every journey. Along water and grassland margins, Homo erectus learned not to dominate an environment, but to move with its temporary patterns, returning again and again to the narrow places where survival remained possible. The narrow places where survival remained possible were also the places where stone accumulated, wood could be gathered, and fire, if it was available, could be kept from wind and rain. Homo erectus did not survive so long with one universal toolkit. Across its enormous range, different populations struck stone in different ways, selected different raw materials, and solved similar problems with technologies that could look surprisingly unlike one another. The old picture of progress moving neatly from crude flakes to refined hand axes is no more accurate than the old ladder of human evolution. Simple and elaborate methods overlapped for hundreds of thousands of years because tools answered local needs, not a single timetable of intelligence. The earliest Homo erectus populations inherited Mode 1 traditions often grouped under the name Older One. A stone core was struck to remove a sharp flake, and both the flake and the battered core could be useful. These objects sometimes appear visually plain, especially beside a carefully shaped hand axe, but their production required knowledge of fracture angles, suitable stone, hand control, and the immediate purpose of the edge. A flake sharp enough to slice hide or plant fiber might take only a few blows to create. Refining it further would waste time and material. What looks primitive from a museum case may have been an efficient disposable technology. At Dmanisi, hominins living outside Africa around 1.8 million years ago used relatively simple Mode 1 tools. They did not carry the classic Acheulean hand axe tradition into the Caucasus. Their success therefore weakens the idea that continental expansion required a technical revolution. Small-brained humans could cross unfamiliar landscapes with flakes, cores, memory, and social knowledge. The missing equipment may have mattered just as much. Digging sticks, wooden clubs, carrying containers made from hide or bark would rarely survive. Archaeology preserves stone because stone is patient, not because stone was the whole technology. Around 1.76 million years ago in Eastern Africa, another tradition becomes visible. large flakes were shaped into hand axes, cleavers, and other Acheulean cutting tools. A hand axe could be worked on both faces, producing a durable edge and, in some examples, symmetry. Creating one required repeated decisions. The napper had to imagine how each blow would alter the remaining mass, control force and angle, correct mistakes, and stop before the tool became too thin or broke. Some pieces were made rapidly for immediate use. Others were transported, resharpened, and maintained over time. The appeal of the hand axe has sometimes distorted the wider record because it looks planned and familiar. It has been treated as an emblem of Homo erectus intelligence, while sites without hand axes were described as technologically backward. Yet Acheulean and Oldoan methods did not form two separate mental worlds. At Gona in Ethiopia, fossils attributed to Homo erectus occur with both traditions around 1.226 million years ago. The same broad population could use simple cores and flakes in one context and large cutting tools in another. Raw material size, quality, distance, and intended task may explain more than any fixed level of cognitive ability. Across much of East and Southeast Asia, classic hand axes are less common or absent at many early sites. This once inspired the idea of a technological boundary dividing an inventive Western world from a conservative Eastern one. The reality is less dramatic. Suitable stone differed, preservation varied, and local populations may have relied more heavily on bamboo or other organic materials. Some Asian sites do contain bifacial tools, while others preserve chopping tools, flakes, and cores suited to local resources. A lack of symmetrical hand axes does not demonstrate a lack of planning. It shows that traditions can diverge when groups are separated across vast distances. Wood is the great missing archive. A sharpened stick can dig roots, probe mud, defend against predators, or help obtain small animals. A heavy branch can break bone. Fibers can bind, carry, or secure. Wooden implements associated with later Middle Pleistocene humans proved that such technologies can be sophisticated, but preservation before that period is extremely rare. For Homo erectus, much of the toolkit must therefore remain inferred. The evidence remains incomplete because the materials most closely connected to daily life usually decayed where they were dropped. Fire presents an even more difficult problem. Burned sediment and bone can result from natural grass fires, lightning, volcanic activity, or material washed into a site. To show that hominins used fire, researchers look for repeated burning in an archaeological context, microscopic ash, heated stone, and evidence that combustion occurred where the remains were found. Even then, using fire is not the same as knowing how to create it. A group could collect flame from a natural source and maintain embers without possessing reliable fire-making technology. Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa has become central to this debate because traces of burning occur far inside the cave, where a natural wildfire is less likely to have swept. Research published in 2012 identified plant ash and burned bone in deposits about 1 million years old, widely regarded as among the strongest early evidence for fire use in place. A 2026 study examined burned bone fragments from deeper layers estimated between roughly 1.79 and 1.07 million years old. Their position within the cave raises the possibility that ancient hominins carried fire inward or maintained it there far earlier than many researchers once accepted. The implications are powerful, but the limits matter. No hominin fossil in those layers identifies the user. The age estimates span a broad range. Burned bone does not prove regular cooking, and neither study demonstrates that the occupants could ignite a fire whenever they wished. Wonderwork may preserve early fire use by Homo erectus or another early human population, but it does not justify the claim that Homo erectus invented fire 2 million years ago. Even occasional control would have changed a place. Flame extends light into darkness, discourages some predators, softens certain foods, warms bodies during cold nights, and creates a visible center around which activity can gather. Smoke repels insects and alters meat or plant materials, yet these advantages need not have appeared together. Fire may first have been opportunistic, difficult to preserve, and lost when fuel became wet or a group moved too quickly. Stone and fire are often presented as inventions made once and then permanently possessed. The deeper record suggests repeated experimentation, uneven transmission, and loss. A technique survives only when someone remembers it, demonstrates it, and another person learns. Across isolated populations, knowledge could disappear as easily as it spread. The patient hands of Homo erectus were therefore part of a social technology larger than any artifact. Every flake, maintained ember, and vanished wooden implement depended on attention passed from one individual to another, preparing the ground for a form of survival that no skeleton could accomplish alone. A tool tradition survives only when one person's actions become another person's memory. That fact pulls Homo erectus out of the museum case and places it among companions. Stone flakes, carried raw material, repeated visits to water, and maintained fire imply behavior distributed across more than one body. Yet that social world is almost invisible. No gesture fossilizes, no voice remains in sediment. Archaeologists can infer cooperation from patterns of survival and shared activity, but they cannot reconstruct a family, hierarchy, or language with confidence. The social species must be approached through indirect clues. One of the most moving comes from Dmanisi. Among the 5 skulls found there is an older individual whose jaws had lost nearly all their teeth long before death. The tooth sockets had healed, showing that this was not a condition from the final days of life. The individual survived for years with greatly reduced chewing ability. In a landscape occupied by large carnivores and seasonal scarcity, that survival demands explanation. Soft foods may have been naturally available. The person could have crushed plants, eaten marrow, consumed tender tissues, or used tools to process food. But many researchers also consider social assistance likely. Others may have shared suitable food or tolerated slower feeding. The evidence does not prove compassion in the modern moral sense. It does not show who provided help, how often, or why. Social support can arise from affection, kinship, reciprocity, group dependence, or tolerance. Still, the healed jaw establishes something more secure than sentiment. A severely toothless individual remained alive within a population surviving far from Africa. Complete independence seems unlikely. The fossil opens a narrow window onto a group in which someone with limited chewing ability was not immediately excluded from food. Such tolerance would have practical value. Homo erectus depended on knowledge accumulated over years where dry season water remained. Which stone fractured cleanly? When animals crossed a valley? How to recognize dangerous tracks? And which plants required processing? An older individual with physical limitations might still preserve information valuable to others. That possibility cannot be demonstrated at Dmanisi, but it shows why care and group survival need not be opposites. Supporting a companion could preserve knowledge no artifact records. Food sharing is harder to prove than carcass processing. Cut marks show flesh was removed, broken bones show marrow extraction. They do not reveal whether one person consumed everything, whether portions were carried away, or whether several individuals gathered around the same resource. Yet large carcasses often provide more food than one individual can use before competitors arrive. Transporting selected limbs or stones to repeated activity areas suggests that resources were sometimes reorganized socially. Even limited sharing would create opportunities for learning. Learning may have been the central social adaptation. A novice watching an experienced napper does not need formal teaching to imitate broad movements, but reliable tool production improves when attention is directed toward useful details. The angle of a blow, support of a core, choice of stone, and moment to abandon a failed piece are difficult to recover through trial alone. Some Herculean tools reflect long practice. Their makers followed no written plans, yet recurring forms persisted across immense distances and time spans. Traditions this durable require repeated exposure between generations. Whether Homo erectus possessed language remains unresolved. The vocal tract is not preserved, and brain endocasts cannot demonstrate grammar or vocabulary. Earlier claims based on the spinal canal or specific brain regions proved less decisive than once hoped. These humans almost certainly communicated through calls, facial expressions, posture, touch, and gesture, as social primates do. They may have used structured vocal signals more elaborate than those of living apes, but there is no direct evidence for modern speech, and making tools or dispersing widely does not prove language. Complex cooperation can exist without sentences. Individuals can coordinate movement by watching direction, pace, and attention. They can gather at familiar locations, respond to alarm, and recognize companions' intentions. Hunting large animals would require greater coordination, but animal tissue could also be obtained through scavenging, ambush, trapping, or encounters leaving no clear signature. The safest conclusion is that Homo erectus lived socially enough to share space, transmit skills, and manage repeated group activities, while the sophistication of communication remains beyond recovery. Developmental evidence from Dmanisi deepens the picture. Microscopic growth lines in one individual's teeth, analyzed in 2024, suggest a pattern unlike either modern humans or living great apes. Early dental development proceeded relatively quickly, but later forming teeth appear to have extended growth over a longer period. The result hints that prolonged human childhood did not appear in one sudden shift. Early Homo may have combined rapid physical development with an emerging period of social dependence. That interpretation must remain cautious. Teeth record growth, not family structure. A longer schedule does not reveal parental investment or cooperative care. Researchers discussed food sharing and support as possible conditions sustaining immature individuals for longer. But these are informed inferences. What the teeth show more securely is that maturation was changing, creating a longer interval in which learning and dependence could become increasingly important. A group with developing juveniles, experienced adults, and physically limited older members would face constant negotiation over movement. Traveling farther could open better resources but burden slower individuals. Remaining near water reduced travel but increased competition and predator exposure. Decisions may have emerged through following, hesitation, repeated routes, and the influence of individuals who knew the landscape. Social organization need not require a leader issuing commands. It can arise from many small acts of attention. The temptation to romanticize is strong. A toothless skull does not prove a prehistoric welfare system, and a hand axe is not evidence of lessons beside a fire. Yet reducing these humans to isolated survival machines is equally unsupported. Their technologies persisted because knowledge moved between people. Their dispersals involved populations reproducing and traveling together. Their recurring sites suggest shared expectations. Injured or impaired members sometimes lived long enough for bones to heal. The social world of Homo erectus was therefore neither modern nor simple. It occupied an evolutionary middle ground that may have varied between populations. Some groups may have shared extensively, others may have been less cohesive. Communication, tolerance, and learning could expand without becoming identical to our own. What survives suggests that the decisive unit of adaptation was no longer merely the individual body. It was the group carrying knowledge through space. That group was about to move farther than any earlier hominin population securely known from fossils. The first expansion beyond Africa did not require giant brains, standardized hand axes, or proven language. It required enough cooperation to keep companions together, enough memory to connect unfamiliar resources, and enough flexibility to continue when the landscape ceased to resemble home. The footsteps leading north were made by individuals, but the journey belonged to communities. Communities, not lone explorers, carried the human story beyond Africa. The movement unfolded through ordinary choices repeated across generations following a river after familiar plants thinned, tracking animals into a neighboring valley, returning to a distant stone source, or remaining near water as rainfall shifted the useful edge of a habitat. A journey that appears continental on a modern map could have felt local at every step. Yet over thousands of years, those steps placed early Homo in environments no earlier hominin is securely known to have occupied. The route out was never a single road. Northeastern Africa opens towards Sinai and the Levant, while Arabian landscapes change as climate and sea level fluctuate. Farther north, the Caucasus forms a threshold between Western Asia and the Eurasian interior. Rivers, lake margins, open woodland, and grassland corridors expanded and contracted across these regions. During favorable periods, animals and plants familiar to African populations extended northward, creating connected belts of usable habitat. During harsher periods, deserts widened, mountain passes grew colder, and the same routes fragmented into refuges. Early dispersal depended on ecological continuity more than geographical knowledge. Homo erectus, or early Homo closely related to it, did not need to understand that Africa lay behind and Eurasia ahead. Groups needed only to recognize food, water, stone, shelter, and danger from one day to the next. Long legs reduced the cost of travel. Flexible diets allowed unfamiliar resources to supplement familiar ones. Simple stone technologies could be recreated wherever suitable material existed. Social memory linked one stopping place to another. Together, these traits made expansion possible without a migration plan. The oldest widely accepted fossil evidence outside Africa comes from Dmanisi in Georgia, where hominins were present roughly 1.85 to 1.77 million years ago. Their existence there shows that the first major expansion happened early, before the classic large-brained form of Homo erectus had developed, and before Acheulean hand axes became its later symbol. The Dmanisi individuals retained small brains and several primitive features. Their tools were relatively simple. What carried them into the Caucasus was not technological magnificence but adaptability. Dmanisi may not have been an isolated outpost. At Orozmani, about 20 kilometers away, excavators have recovered a hominin tooth, stone tools, animal fossils, and, in 2025, a jawbone reported as roughly 1.8 million years old. Detailed analysis has not yet been widely published, so its classification remains preliminary. Even so, the site suggests early Homo occupied a broader Caucasus landscape rather than one locality. Deer, horses, elephants, giraffids, hyenas, and saber-toothed cats moved through that world, making it connected to regions farther south, while introducing new seasonal pressures. Seasonality may have been the true test. Northern latitudes impose stronger cycles of temperature, daylight, and plant productivity. Winter reduces vegetation, freezes some water sources, and changes animal movement. Early Homo populations entering such regions needed strategies for lean months. They may have followed herds, used carcasses, returned to protected valleys, or shifted elevation. Fire could have helped if available, but early dispersal does not depend on proving regular fire use. Clothing, fitted shelters, and food storage are likewise unconfirmed. The evidence suggests these populations survived with modest technology, perhaps by remaining within ecological zones that stayed manageable. Expansion eastward posed different problems. Central Asia contained mountains, deserts, river basins, and steppe corridors whose habitability changed with climate. A route could open for centuries and then vanish beneath aridity or cold. Populations may have advanced, retreated, and advanced again. The archaeological record preserves only a few points from this moving network, creating the illusion of giant leaps between sites. Countless generations must have lived in the missing spaces. Recent dating at Yunxian in central China has made the speed of this process more startling. 3 nearly complete skulls have been placed at about 1.77 million years ago, with an uncertainty of roughly 80,000 years. If that age remains secure, Homo erectus reached deep into East Asia at almost the same time that early Homo lived at Dmanisi. Such a chronology compresses a seemingly slow expansion into rapid dispersal across Eurasia. It does not identify the exact route or prove a single eastward wave. Several movements may have occurred, and the first populations could have left few descendants. Stone tools suggest that some dispersals may predate the earliest fossils. At Shangchen in China, artifacts have been reported from layers older than 2 million years. Without associated hominin bones, the makers cannot be identified. The tools may represent an earlier expansion by Homo, or their interpretation and dating may continue to be tested. It is safer to say that Dmanisi preserves the earliest broadly accepted fossil population outside Africa. Not that no hominin crossed earlier. Movement into island Southeast Asia added another scale of difficulty. Java sometimes connected to the mainland through exposed Sundaland, but reaching it still required passage through changing environments. The earliest secure arrival date at Sangaran remains debated. Some studies place reliable occupation around 1.3 million years ago, with an upper limit near 1.45 million, while other geological models allow arrival closer to 1.8 million years ago. The disagreement does not erase the larger fact Homo erectus reached Java early, and persisted there for an extraordinary time. Even more puzzling are islands never joined to the continent. Stone tools from Sulawesi indicate that a hominin reached the island at least about 1.04 million years ago, and perhaps earlier. No human fossil identifies the traveller. Homo erectus is plausible, but an unknown lineage or a population related to later island hominins cannot be excluded, nor do the tools prove boats. The crossing may have involved a crude raft, accidental drifting after a storm, or deliberate movement across visible water. No single explanation fully accounts for these passages. The Great Expansion was not one triumphant march. It was a pattern of small populations entering corridors, becoming isolated, adapting locally, and sometimes disappearing. Some movements failed. Others founded lineages that endured for hundreds of thousands of years. Geographic success did not erase anatomical diversity, it increased it. As groups spread farther apart, their skulls, tools, diets, and traditions followed regional histories. By the time Homo erectus occupied the Caucasus, East Asia, and Java, humanity had ceased to be primarily an African phenomenon, though its deepest roots remained there. This same broad lineage now faced winters, monsoons, volcanic islands, dry basins, and unfamiliar predators. Its range became vast enough that distant populations never knew of one another. The name Homo erectus binds them together in science, but their lived worlds were separated by mountains, deserts, seas, and thousands of generations. To see what the first successful migrants were actually like, the story must return to the Caucasus, where 5 faces preserved in one place would challenge almost every tidy boundary drawn around them. The 5 faces at Dmanisi do not look like a single answer. They look like a disagreement preserved in stone. One skull is small and lightly built. Another has a broad face and heavy jaws. One belongs to the nearly toothless older individual who survived long after losing most teeth. The 5th, often called skull 5, combines a remarkably small brain case with a large, projecting face and massive jaw. If these fossils had been discovered at separate sites, scattered across different regions or ages, they might easily have been assigned to several species. Instead, they emerge from the same archaeological setting, forcing researchers to confront how much variation one early human population could contain. Dmanisi lies in southern Georgia, beneath the ruins of a medieval settlement where 2 rivers meet. About 1.8 million years ago, the landscape held open woodland, grassland, watercourses, and volcanic terrain supporting deer, horses, elephants, giraffes, hyenas, and saber-toothed cats. Early Homo lived within this community, using simple stone flakes and cores while navigating a region that connected the Near East, the Caucasus, and lands farther north. The site's dating, placed between about 185 and 1.77 million years ago, makes it a major window onto the first widely accepted human dispersal beyond Africa. The fossils are unusually associated: 5 crania, several jaws, postcranial bones, and thousands of stone artifacts come from deposits formed within a limited span. Researchers debate exactly how the bodies accumulated. Some may have fallen into natural cavities, been dragged by carnivores, or accumulated through several processes. The individuals were not necessarily a family, and they did not all die on the same day. Yet geologically and archaeologically they belong to one local population rather than to widely separated evolutionary stages. That shared context changes the taxonomic problem. Before Skull 5 was described in detail, differences among early Homo fossils from Africa had helped support distinctions between Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, early Homo erectus, and sometimes Homo ergaster. Skull 5 showed that a small group from one place could vary across many of the same features used to separate species elsewhere. Its brain volume was only about 546 cubic centimeters, near the lower end for early Homo, while its face and jaw were exceptionally robust. Other Dmanisi skulls reached roughly 730 cubic centimeters and differed strongly in facial form. The variation could reflect sex, age, individual development, or population diversity. Some researchers therefore argued that much of early Homo might belong to a single highly variable evolutionary lineage. In that view, Several named species could represent regional or chronological forms within a broader Homo erectus lineage. Others objected that 5 individuals from Dmanisi cannot erase consistent anatomical patterns across Africa, and that combining too many fossils under one name conceals real evolutionary diversity. Scholars still debate the issue because both positions confront incomplete samples. Dmanisi expands the known range of variation, but it does not provide a universal measurement for every early Homo population. Even the site's inhabitants have carried several names. They were initially described as Homo erectus, then sometimes as Homo georgicus, and often more cautiously as early Homo closely related to Homo erectus. Their anatomy is primitive in some respects, small brains, projecting faces, and modest body size. Yet their lower limbs support efficient upright walking, and their presence in the Caucasus demonstrates ecological flexibility. They reveal that the first successful dispersers did not need all the traits seen in later African or Asian erectus populations. Their tools strengthen that conclusion. Dmanisi preserves Mode 1 technology flakes, cores, and simple cutting implements rather than the large bifacial hand axes associated with the Acheulean. These artifacts could produce sharp edges for processing animal tissue and working plants or wood. Their apparent simplicity should not be confused with careless behavior. Stone was selected, struck, and used within a continuing tradition. The surprising detail is not that the migrants lacked advanced tools, but that such compact technology travelled so effectively with them. The animal bones suggest access to carcasses, although the balance between hunting, confrontational scavenging, and opportunistic use remains unclear. Cut marks occur, but carnivore activity also shaped the assemblage. Early Homo shared Dmanisi with predators that could kill them. Tooth marks on some hominin remains have encouraged discussion of carnivore involvement, yet reconstructing a single dramatic event would exceed the evidence. What survives instead is a landscape in which humans were both consumers and potential prey, relying on group awareness rather than dominance. The nearly toothless individual adds a different kind of evidence. Bone had remodeled around the empty sockets, indicating survival for years after tooth loss. Soft foods, marrow, and careful processing may have reduced dependence on chewing. Social support is plausible, perhaps likely, but cannot be directly observed. The fossil does not allow a sentimental scene to be recovered. It shows that vulnerability did not automatically mean immediate death, and that this population's survival strategies could accommodate an impaired adult. Recent dental research adds another layer. Microscopic growth structures suggest that a young Dmanisi individual developed teeth through a pattern, combining relatively rapid early growth with more extended development of later teeth. The result is neither fully ape-like nor fully modern human. It suggests that prolonged childhood emerged in stages, perhaps alongside greater reliance on learning and food sharing. The authors discuss social provisioning, but teeth record timing, not affection or household organization. The evidence remains incomplete. Dmanisi therefore disrupts several assumptions at once. It shows dispersal without large brains, survival without Acheulean hand axes, and population diversity great enough to blur species boundaries. It demonstrates that early human evolution cannot be reconstructed by arranging isolated skulls from smallest to largest. A small brain can coexist with a body capable of continental movement. A massive jaw can belong to the same population as a more delicate face. Primitive and derived traits can persist together rather than arriving in coordinated packages. The site does not prove that every fossil once assigned to a separate species should be folded into Homo erectus, nor does it prove that the first migrants were direct ancestors of later Asians. Dmanisi may represent an early expansion that eventually vanished. While other populations moved eastward later, its family tree position remains uncertain, but its 5 faces establish a principle that follows Homo erectus across the Old World. Variation is not noise around the story. Variation is the story itself. From the Caucasus, that principle stretches toward East Asia, where skulls, lost collections, harsh winters, and newly recovered molecular traces complicate the lineage further. Dmanisi has already removed the need for a large brain or elaborate toolkit at the beginning of the journey. The question farther east is what happened when those journeys continued across immense distances and local populations began changing in isolation, leaving behind fossils that looked related but never identical. East Asia does not preserve Homo erectus as one frozen population. It preserves regional lives scattered across caves, river terraces, basins, and deposits separated by enormous distances. Northern China could be bitterly cold during glacial phases, while central and southern regions shifted between woodland, grassland, and monsoon-fed environments. Populations there faced strong seasonality, yet the archaeological record rarely shows how they met winter, scarcity, or isolation. Instead, it offers skull fragments, teeth, stone tools, burned material of uncertain origin, and molecular traces extracted from enamel. Zhoukoudian, southwest of Beijing, became the most famous of these sites. Excavations in the early 20th century recovered remains of numerous individuals from a cave system, along with animal bones and stone artifacts. The fossils were originally called Sinanthropus pekinensis, Peking man, before being incorporated into Homo erectus. Their low vaults, heavy brows, thick cranial bones, and relatively large brains made them seem more advanced than the small-brained migrants from Dmanisi. They belong to a regional population shaped by hundreds of thousands of years in East Asia. The cave deposits accumulated through complicated processes. Hominins may have entered repeatedly, carnivores may have dragged bodies and prey inside, and sediment moved bones through chambers. Earlier interpretations imagined a long-term home with regular hearths. Later work became more cautious. Burned bones and ash-like deposits exist, but some may reflect natural processes or displaced material. Stone tools and butchered animal remains confirm human activity, yet the character of occupation remains debated. Zhoukoudian was not one intact campsite. It was a palimpsest created by visits, predators, fires, and geological change. Its scientific history carries another loss. During the Second World War, the original fossils disappeared while being transported for safekeeping. Crates containing skulls, jaws, and teeth vanished, and their location remains unknown. Plaster casts, photographs, measurements, and descriptions survived, allowing research to continue. But the absence of the originals limits what modern methods can examine. The missing collection has inspired stories of shipwrecks, hidden cargo, and secret storage, yet none has been verified. Some of the most important human fossils ever found were lost during wartime confusion. Other Chinese sites prevent Zhoukoudian from standing alone. Hexian, Nanjing, Lantian, Yunxian, and other localities preserve different combinations of erectus-like anatomy. Some specimens are robust and thick-walled, others complicate a strict regional pattern. Their dates have been repeatedly revised as methods improve. An older or younger age can transform the same skull from an ancestral form into a surviving regional variant. Yunxian has produced one of the most dramatic revisions. 3 nearly complete but heavily distorted skulls from Hubei province were long thought to be much younger. A 2026 study using burial dating based on aluminum-26 and beryllium-10 placed them at approximately 1.77 million years ago. With an uncertainty of about 80,000 years, if the result holds, they are the oldest Homo erectus skulls found in their original depositional context in East Asia. Their age brings them close to Dmanisi, and implies that early humans crossed Eurasia far more rapidly than older models allowed. The Yunxian date does not prove these were the first humans in China. Stone tools at Shangchen may be older, but no hominin fossil identifies their makers, nor does Yunxian reveal whether one population moved continuously from the Caucasus to central China. Dispersal could have involved waves, pauses, extinctions, and replacements. It shows that the eastern reach of early Homo may have been established almost as soon as the western expansion becomes visible in Georgia. Farther north, survival required flexibility that fossils only hint at. Winter reduces edible plants and changes animal movement. Rivers freeze, daylight shortens, and open ground exposes bodies to cold wind. Regular fire, clothing, shelters, or stored food would help, but direct evidence for these practices among early Chinese Homo erectus remains limited. They may have occupied northern sites mainly during milder periods. They may also have used caves, hides, windbreaks, or seasonal mobility in ways that left little trace. The evidence remains incomplete, and the presence of fossils cannot tell us whether occupation was continuous or repeatedly abandoned. Stone technology in China also resists simple comparison with the African Acheulean. Many assemblages rely on flakes, cores, choppers, and locally available stone. Some sites contain bifacial tools, but the classic hand axe tradition is uneven. Older explanations treated this as proof of cultural conservatism or intellectual limitation. A better interpretation considers raw material, task, mobility, and tradition. Quartz and quartzite fracture differently from large, fine-grained blocks. A population can remain successful with less standardized tools because effectiveness is not measured by symmetry. The most unexpected evidence now comes from teeth. In 2026, researchers recovered ancient enamel proteins from 6 Homo erectus individuals, roughly 400,000 years old at Zhoukudian, Hexian, and Sunjiadong. 5 were identified as male and 1 as female through sex-linked protein markers. This was not DNA sequencing and did not produce a complete genome. Proteins preserve less information than DNA, but they can survive far longer in difficult environments. All 6 individuals shared 2 amino acid variants in the enamel protein ameloblastin. One, known as A23G, has not been observed in other tested human lineages. Another, M273V, also appears in Denisovan material. Researchers proposed that the shared variant may reflect gene flow from an East Asian population related to Homo erectus into ancestors or relatives of Denisovans. Some associated archaic genetic segments may later have reached Homo sapiens through Denisovan ancestry. This is a plausible pathway, not a reconstructed meeting or proof that every East Asian erectus population contributed directly to Denisovans. The protein evidence is important precisely because it is limited. No nuclear or mitochondrial DNA has yet been recovered directly from Homo erectus. The enamel molecules cannot reveal appearance, language, population size, or the exact place of contact. They do show that molecular history can survive where bones alone seemed silent. They also weaken the picture of East Asian Homo erectus as a completely isolated dead end. Some populations may have participated in a network of ancestry and gene exchange, extending into later archaic humans. China's record therefore combines speed, endurance, and loss. Yongxian suggests an astonishingly early arrival. Zhoukudian preserves repeated occupation and then loses its original fossils to modern war. Regional tool traditions challenge assumptions about technological progress. Enamel proteins open a narrow molecular path toward Denisovans without producing a simple family tree. Across cold basins and cave systems, Homo erectus became locally distinctive while remaining connected, in ways still difficult to measure, to the larger human world. The eastern frontier was never merely the endpoint of an African journey. It became its own evolutionary landscape, occupied long enough for anatomy, behavior, and heredity to change. Yet farther south and east, beyond continental winters, another population entered volcanic Java, where rivers, eruptions, and changing seas would preserve the longest and most haunting regional history of all. Java was never a fixed island waiting at the edge of Asia. During glacial periods, falling seas exposed the lowlands of Sundaland, joining Java to Borneo, Sumatra, and the mainland. During warmer intervals, water returned and broke those plains apart. Volcanoes rebuilt horizons. Monsoons shifted. Rivers abandoned channels and carved new ones through fresh sediment. Homo erectus entered this unstable world early and remained through changes so great that the same region alternated between continental corridor, volcanic interior, and island refuge. The earliest arrival remains disputed. Fossils from Sangiran have often been placed among the oldest Homo erectus remains in Java, but dating the deposits has proved difficult. A 2020 study argued that the most reliable first appearance at Sangiran lies around 1.3 million years ago, with a possible upper limit near 1.45 million. A later geological model proposed that the lineage may have reached Java closer to 1.8 million years ago. The results do not yet form one settled chronology. It is safest to say that Homo erectus was present in Java by at least about 1.5 million years ago, while some models allow an earlier arrival. Sangiran preserves far more than a date. Its uplifted sediments expose layers formed by rivers, lakes, volcanic ash, and changing soils. Fossils recovered there represent numerous individuals across long spans, making the region one of the richest Homo erectus archives. Yet most specimens are fragments, often moved by water before burial. Teeth, jaws, and skull pieces come from deposits reconstructed through stratigraphy and geology. The landscape repeatedly disturbed its own record. Volcanism was not merely catastrophic. Ash could bury surfaces rapidly, enrich soils, dam rivers, and create lakes. Eruptions destroyed local habitats but also generated terrain later occupied by plants and animals. Homo erectus populations living in Java knew a world where distant peaks smoked. Ash altered water, and familiar routes could vanish within a generation. No evidence shows how they understood eruptions, but their persistence demonstrates repeated recolonization of disturbed landscapes. Trinil belongs to this riverine world. The skullcap found by Eugène Dubois came from deposits beside the Solo River, along with a femur recovered nearby and animal remains. The river preserved fossils while creating uncertainty by transporting and mixing them. Trinil became both the birthplace of Pithecanthropus erectus and a warning about reading river deposits too literally. A bone found near another bone need not belong to the same individual moment or exact layer. The Solo River later shaped the record at Ngandong, where the youngest securely dated Homo erectus fossils were recovered from a terrace above the channel. 12 skull caps and 2 shin bones were associated with deposits placed around 117,000 to 108,000 years ago. The concentration is unusual, but its cause remains debated. Flood action may have transported bodies or isolated bones into one zone. The individuals may have died across different events and accumulated through river sorting. Nothing requires a single mass death. Between early Sangiran and late Ngandong lies more than 1 million years of regional change. Java moved through cycles of connection and isolation as sea levels rose and fell. When Sundaland emerged, river systems crossed plains now submerged beneath the Java Sea and surrounding straits. Animals and hominins could move through landscapes linking Java to mainland Southeast Asia. When seas returned, populations became fragmented. Isolation could reduce gene flow, concentrate local traits, and make small groups more vulnerable. A discovery from the Madura Strait has made that drowned world visible. In 2025, researchers described 2 Homo erectus skull fragments and thousands of animal fossils dredged from an ancient river valley beneath the seabed northeast of Java. The deposits were placed between roughly 163,000 and 119,000 years ago, often summarized as about 140,000 years old. Lower sea level then exposed a broad Sundaland plain where rivers supported large mammals and human activity. The Madura fossils matter because they come from a landscape absent from maps of Java prehistory. The strait was not a marine barrier but part of a river system. Cut marks on freshwater turtle bones and patterns of breaking bovid bones for marrow may indicate behaviors not commonly documented in earlier Javanese assemblages. Researchers have suggested possible contact or cultural exchange with populations arriving from mainland areas, but direct evidence remains lacking. The finds do not prove interbreeding, migration by one named group, or a technological revolution. They show that late Javanese Homo erectus may have lived within a more connected Sundaland than an island-only story allows. Monsoon changes continually altered that connection. Rainfall determined river depth, vegetation density, and open habitat. During drier phases, grasslands and woodland could spread, supporting grazing animals familiar from many erectus environments. Wetter phases encouraged denser forest and change prey distribution. A population successful in open valleys might struggle as visibility decreased. Travel became harder, and animal communities reorganized. This shift has often been linked to the disappearance of Homo erectus at Ngandong, but the relationship remains correlational. Java's late erectus populations were not biologically frozen survivors. Their skulls show large brains relative to many earlier members of the lineage, with robust vaults and distinctive regional anatomy. They persisted long enough to accumulate local adaptations and perhaps traditions. Their tools were not uniformly Acheulean, and surviving assemblages rarely reveal the full range of organic technology. River environments may have encouraged bamboo, wood, fibers, and aquatic resources that left faint archaeological signatures. The island setting also raises questions about contact. At low sea levels, Java belonged to a continental shelf world, but islands farther east remained separated by deep water. Hominins reached Flores and Sulawesi, though the identity of the earliest travellers remains uncertain. Homo erectus is a plausible participant in some movements, given its presence in Java, but the evidence does not justify planned fleets crossing the archipelago. Water barriers could have been crossed deliberately, accidentally, or by populations whose fossils remain unknown. By Ngandong's time, Java was both refuge and trap. The Solo Valley may have preserved open habitats after conditions changed elsewhere, allowing Homo erectus to survive later there than in other known regions. Yet refuge populations are often small and constrained. Their persistence can depend on a narrow ecological balance. If forests expanded, prey shifted, rivers reorganized, or new human populations entered Sundaland, the refuge could shrink beyond recovery. No single eruption, flood, or rising sea ended the Javanese lineage. The deeper pattern is cumulative instability. Java repeatedly offered corridors, resources, and protected valleys, then rearranged them. Homo erectus endured because it could adjust. But every adjustment occurred within populations separated by water, terrain, and time. The island at the edge of worlds was not merely the final station of the migration. It was a changing evolutionary arena where a regional humanity survived for more than 1 million years, until the rivers preserved its last skulls and the surrounding world changed once more. The long survival of Homo erectus in Java makes the name feel solid, as if it identifies one clearly bounded species recognizable wherever it appears. The fossils resist that confidence. A Javanese skull may have a thick, long vault and a pronounced ridge at the back. An African specimen may be more lightly built, with a different cranial contour and body form. Dmanisi adds small brains and strongly varying faces. Chinese fossils introduce further combinations of brow shape, vault thickness, dental anatomy, and regional traits. All are often placed beneath the same label, yet the label stretches across almost 2 million years and 3 continents. Some researchers divide the record. In this view, African fossils associated with the early, tall-bodied form belong to Homo ergaster, while Homo erectus in the strict sense refers mainly to Asian populations. The distinction recognizes that specimens such as the Nariokotomi skeleton and several East African crania differ from classic fossils in Java and China. If these patterns reflect separate evolutionary histories rather than population variation, 2 species names may be justified. Other researchers emphasize continuity. They regard Homo ergaster as an early African expression of Homo erectus, not a separate species. Bodies and skulls changed as populations spread, became isolated, and adapted locally, just as widespread living species can develop strong regional differences. From this perspective, dividing every distinctive population risks turning geography into taxonomy. A broad Homo erectus can accommodate substantial variation without requiring a new species for every region. Neither approach is merely an argument over words. Species names shape the evolutionary story. If African Homo ergaster is distinct, then the lineage moving into Eurasia may represent a branch whose Asian history became increasingly separate. If all belong to Homo erectus, the species becomes one of the most variable and successful, maintaining a recognizable anatomical theme while changing dramatically across time. The choice affects which fossils are treated as ancestors, cousins, or regional survivors. Dmanisi makes every definition more difficult. The 5 skulls vary so strongly that isolated discoveries might have received different names. Yet their shared context shows that one local population can contain a small-brained individual with a massive face, another with a more delicate build, and others spanning much of the difference. This does not prove that all early Homo fossils belong to one species. It does show that facial robusticity, jaw size, and brain volume can vary within a population more than earlier samples suggested. Taxonomy built from single skulls must remain cautious. Sexual dimorphism may explain part of the range, but not all of it. Males and females can differ in average size and robusticity, while age alters brow development, tooth wear, and cranial form, nutrition, disease, and developmental stress also affect growth. Yet fossil sex is often uncertain, and a handful of individuals cannot reveal a population's full distribution. Researchers may interpret a large face as a male trait, regional adaptation, or evidence of a separate species, depending on which comparison they trust. Time compounds the problem. An early African skull near 2 million years old should not be expected to match a Javanese skull more than 1 million years younger. Evolution continues within named species. Brain size generally increases, cranial architecture shifts, and local traits accumulate. A fossil can differ because it belongs to another species, another population, or simply because hundreds of thousands of years separate it from the comparison. These explanations can produce similar anatomical patterns. The Gona skull Dan5P1 adds an awkward combination. Its small brain and primitive face coexist with features associated with Homo erectus, although it lived around 1.6 to 1.5 million years ago, after the lineage had dispersed beyond Africa. The 2025 reconstruction supports a mosaic model in which erectus-like traits emerged in different anatomical regions at different rates. Such a fossil fits poorly into a scheme expecting one clean transition from Homo habilis to Homo erectus. It may represent a variable African population, a retained primitive branch, or gene flow among neighbouring groups. The evidence remains incomplete. Drimeland's DNH-134 presents the same problem near the proposed beginning. At roughly 2 million years old, it is often identified as one of the earliest Homo erectus fossils, but both classification and dating continue to be discussed. If accepted, it shows erectus existing alongside Paranthropus robustus and Australopithecus sediba. If reassigned, the origin point shifts again. A partial cranium can therefore influence whether a species appears early, late, widespread, or regionally restricted. Asian fossils create their own naming debates. Some Chinese specimens sit comfortably within Homo erectus, while others, especially later and more unusual crania, have been assigned to archaic Homo, possible Denisovan-related populations, or separate proposed species. Java also contains variation through time, from earlier Sangiran forms to distinctive late Ngandong skulls. The temptation is to draw firm boundaries wherever morphology changes. Yet populations can exchange genes, split, reconnect, and absorb one another without producing the clean forks shown in diagrams. The protein evidence from Chinese enamel makes that possibility harder to ignore. A shared ameloblast invariant between sampled Homo erectus and Denisovan material is consistent with ancient genetic contact somewhere among East Asian populations. It does not prove direct descent or identify the participants precisely, but it suggests that lineages treated as separate taxonomic units may still have exchanged genes. In human evolution, biological boundaries were often porous. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens remained distinguishable while interbreeding. Homo erectus may have occupied a similarly complicated network, though direct DNA has not survived to reveal it. There is also the possibility that Homo erectus is best understood not as one narrow species, but as an evolutionary grade populations sharing a more human-like body and broadly similar cranial pattern, while differing in ancestry and later fate. Many specialists resist this solution because a grade can conceal branching relationships. Still, it captures why the name remains useful even when its borders are disputed. It identifies a major adaptive transformation without pretending every fossil belonged to one freely interbreeding population. No taxonomy can recover the categories ancient humans would have recognized. Neighboring groups may have encountered one another as familiar, foreign, or entirely unknown. Distant populations in Java and Africa could never have met, regardless of the name modern science gives them. Species are hypotheses built from anatomy, chronology, geography, and increasingly molecules. They are revised when new evidence makes an old boundary less convincing. The most accurate image is not one figure walking unchanged through 2 million years. It is a constellation of populations, some connected, some isolated, some perhaps ancestral to later humans, and others ending without descendants. The name Homo erectus holds that constellation together provisionally. Its uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is evidence of how evolution proceeds, through variation that refuses to organize itself for the convenience of those arriving long afterward. A lineage can survive for almost 2 million years and still become vulnerable in a few thousand generations. Homo erectus endured because different populations repeatedly adjusted to new rivers, climates, foods, and landscapes. That history, however, may have left the lineage divided into small regional groups, each carrying local adaptations that worked only while familiar conditions remained. The end was probably not one event. It was a series of endings, separated by continents, climates, and evolutionary paths. In Africa, the Erectus story may not have ended through simple extinction. Some populations assigned to Homo erectus or Homo ergaster may have contributed to later Middle Pleistocene humans. Anatomical change, population mixing, and regional continuity could have transformed them into descendant lineages rather than removing them. The boundary between survival and disappearance becomes difficult to draw when one population slowly changes into another. A species name may end in the fossil record while ancestry continues. In East Asia, the outcome may have differed. Chinese Homo erectus populations persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, but their later relationship to Denisovans and other archaic humans remains unresolved. Ancient enamel proteins suggest genetic contact, yet they do not reveal whether erectus populations were absorbed, replaced, or survived alongside newcomers. Some ancestry may have passed into later humans while the recognizable anatomy disappeared. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and molecular evidence remains too limited to reconstruct the final exchanges. Java offers the clearest late survival and the deepest extinction mystery. At Ngandong, Homo erectus remains present around 17,000 to 108,000 years ago. The surrounding landscape appears to have supported open woodland and grassland animals familiar to the regional population. Not long afterward, conditions became wetter in much of the area, with denser tropical forest expanding and older faunal communities declining. The timing makes ecological change a compelling suspect. But rainforest alone is not an executioner. Forest expansion changes the distribution of food, visibility, travel, and prey. Large grazing animals become less common. Rivers alter their channels. Open corridors close. Plant resources change in type and season. A population adapted to moving through broad valleys and exploiting large mammals may face increasing costs without one dramatic catastrophe. Each generation travels farther for familiar foods. Encounters between groups become rarer. Birth rates fall. A flood, drought, disease episode, or failed season then has greater consequences because fewer neighboring populations remain to replace losses. Small population size may have been decisive. Fossils create an illusion of continuity because discoveries are spread across immense time. In reality, late Homo erectus populations may have been sparse. A species can occupy a large map while existing as disconnected communities with little gene flow. Isolation increases vulnerability to inbreeding, local disasters, and the loss of technical knowledge. If one group disappears, another may be too distant to recolonize the region. Sea level repeatedly changed the shape of Sundaland. During low stands, Java connected to broader plains and river systems. During high stands, populations became more isolated. These cycles opened and closed migration routes, altered animal movement, and shifted ecological refuges. A valley that once linked Java to mainland Southeast Asia could become submerged. A river rich in freshwater foods could vanish beneath a strait. The Madura discoveries show how inhabited landscape now lies underwater, and how incomplete any extinction narrative must remain. Volcanism added disruption, but no known eruption can be identified as the final cause. Java's populations had lived with volcanic activity for more than 1 million years. Ash falls could destroy vegetation and contaminate water, yet they also created fertile soils and new habitats. A severe eruption may have damaged a small population, but the disappearance cannot be tied to one layer, date, or mountain. Competition with other humans remains possible. Denisovan-related groups or other archaic populations may have entered parts of Southeast Asia. Homo sapiens was spreading across wider Asia by the later Pleistocene. Newcomers might have competed for prey, occupied river corridors, introduced unfamiliar diseases, or exchanged genes with local populations. Yet there is no direct evidence that Homo sapiens encountered Homo erectus at Ngandong, much less killed them. The image of modern humans exterminating a primitive rival is dramatic, simple, and unsupported. Interbreeding offers a quieter possibility. If late erectus-related groups mixed with incoming archaic humans, their lineage may have been partly absorbed rather than erased. The 2026 protein evidence from China makes ancient gene exchange plausible in principle, but it cannot be extended automatically to Java. No DNA has been recovered from Ngandong, and no present-day population can be confidently identified as carrying a Homo erectus contribution. Absorption remains possible, not demonstrated. Technology may have influenced resilience, though it should not be reduced to a contest between simple and advanced tools. Late Homo erectus populations could solve local problems with technologies suited to their environments. The danger came when environments change faster than traditions could adjust. A successful local strategy can become a trap if it depends on disappearing prey, stone sources, or movement corridors. Cultural flexibility matters most when old knowledge stops producing reliable results. Demography connects all these pressures. Climate change does not need to kill every individual. Competition does not need to produce battles. A lineage can fade when mortality slightly exceeds births over generations, when groups lose contact, and when young adults fail to establish new communities. The fossil record would preserve no final scene, only increasingly rare traces followed by silence. This is why the end of Homo erectus differs from place to place. In Africa, some populations may have evolved into later forms. In China, they may have mixed with or been replaced by other archaic humans. In Java, long isolation, ecological transformation, and demographic weakness may have combined. On distant islands, related populations may have followed different paths. The 2-million-year story did not close with one extinction date because it was never one continuous population. What survives at Ngandong is therefore a last confirmed appearance, not a death certificate. The skull caps mark the latest population we can securely identify, while the final survivors may have lived later in a valley not yet excavated or now drowned beneath the sea. Scholars still debate which pressure mattered most. The most responsible answer is the least theatrical. Several forces probably converged, amplified by small, isolated populations. The mystery remains because disappearance is easier to detect than process. Fossils can show that a lineage was present, then absent. They rarely preserve declining fertility, broken migration routes, lost knowledge, or generations growing smaller in number. Homo erectus survived storms of climate and geography for longer than our own species has existed. Its end was not proof of inferiority. It was proof that endurance has limits, especially when the world changes in several ways at once, and no neighbouring population remains close enough to carry the story forward. The shadow Homo erectus leaves behind is larger than any single fossil species. It stands near the beginning of a body plan that becomes increasingly familiar, yet it also belongs to worlds in which several human forms shared landscapes without knowing they were branches of one evolutionary history. Its long legs, efficient stride, flexible diet, repeated use of stone, and capacity to survive from African semi-desert to northern China did not make it modern. They created a durable platform on which later human lineages could evolve, diverge, meet, and sometimes exchange genes. For much of the 20th century, Homo erectus was often placed in a simple ancestral position between earlier Homo and ourselves. The image was attractive. A small-brain toolmaker stood upright, left Africa, mastered fire, enlarged its brain, and eventually became Homo sapiens. Almost every part of that sequence now requires qualification. Upright walking began millions of years earlier. Stone tools predate Homo erectus by more than 1 million years. Fire use remains uneven and difficult to assign. Brain expansion was gradual and regionally variable. Some erectus populations may lie near the ancestry of later humans, while others were distant regional branches that ended without becoming us. The lineage's greatest legacy may therefore be diversity rather than direction. At Dmanisi, an early erectus-like cranium appears beside other hominin species. At Dmanisi, 5 faces reveal how much variation one population can contain. At unchanging, unexpectedly ancient skulls suggest that dispersal across Eurasia happened with remarkable speed. In Java, regional populations persisted through more than 1 million years of volcanic and climatic change. In China, enamel proteins hint that ancient populations were connected to Denisovan-related ancestry in ways bones alone could never show. None of these discoveries supports a single march toward modern humanity. Together they reveal populations spreading, separating, adapting, and sometimes reconnecting. Even footprints complicate the idea of one humanity replacing another. At Kubifora in Kenya, track surfaces about 1.5 million years old preserve at least 2 distinct hominin foot patterns crossing the same lakeside landscape. A 2024 analysis attributed one pattern to Homo erectus and the other to Paranthropus boisei. The tracks do not prove that the makers saw one another, cooperated, or competed. They record something quieter and more powerful. Different kinds of humans use the same muddy margin within a narrow interval of time. For a moment, parallel evolutionary experiments occupied one place, leaving no explanation beyond the direction of their steps. The same uncertainty surrounds the island lineages of Southeast Asia. Homo floresiensis on Flores and Homo luzonensis in the Philippines possess mosaics of primitive and derived anatomy that have encouraged proposals linking them, directly or indirectly, to early dispersing Homo. Homo erectus is often mentioned because it reached Java early, and because some unknown hominin crossed water barriers elsewhere in the region. Yet no fossil sequence securely transforms Javanese erectus into either island species. Their ancestors may have been erectus-related, descended from an earlier dispersal, or represented branches still missing from the record. Sulawesi sharpens this mystery. Stone tools at Callao show that hominins reached the island at least about 1.04 million years ago, and perhaps closer to 1.48 million. Sulawesi was never connected to mainland Asia by exposed land, even when the sea levels fell. Someone crossed open water, but the evidence does not identify who or how. A storm-driven natural raft, a crude watercraft, repeated accidental drift, and deliberate voyaging remain difficult to distinguish archaeologically. Calling the travellers Homo erectus is plausible, not proven. Calling them boat builders would turn possibility into fact. This restraint does not make the achievement smaller. A hominin population reached an island beyond a deep water boundary and left enough descendants, or returned often enough, to create an archaeological record. Whether the crossing was planned or accidental, survival after landfall required water, food, stone, social continuity, and reproduction. The event suggests that the geographic reach of early humans exceeded the fossil map, and that many lineages may have lived where acidic soils, tropical decay, or rising seas erased their bones. The submerged Sundaland record carries the same warning. Fossils from the Madura Strait emerge from a river valley now beneath the sea. Entire migration routes, feeding grounds, and activity areas disappeared when post-glacial waters covered the continental shelf. The known sites are therefore fragments of a much larger inhabited world. Absence on present-day islands or coastlines may reflect drowned evidence rather than ancient emptiness. Homo erectus also changes how success should be measured. It did not build cities, leave written names, or create art that can be confidently recognized. Yet populations associated with the lineage persisted for a span nearly 10 times longer than the current known existence of Homo sapiens. They did so without one uniform technology or anatomy. Their resilience came from variation, mobility, social learning, and repeated adjustment to local conditions. Its endurance also warns against equating familiarity with superiority, because many features that seem recognizably human emerged alongside older traits and succeeded under conditions unlike those favoring us today. This was not invulnerability. It was the ability to continue long enough for the world to change around them many times. Their possible biological legacy remains unresolved. Broad African erectus or ergaster populations may have contributed to later Homo lineages. East Asian populations may have exchanged genes with ancestors or relatives of Denisovans. Some archaic segments eventually reached modern humans through later interbreeding, but no complete Homo erectus genome exists to identify a clean inheritance. The protein evidence opens a door without revealing the room beyond it. It suggests continuity where anatomy once seemed to show only replacement, while leaving the scale and direction of contact uncertain. The final lesson is not that Homo erectus was our primitive ancestor, nor that it was an evolutionary failure overtaken by cleverer humans. It was a changing collection of human populations whose history included origins, dispersals, local experiments, possible mixtures, and regional endings. Some may belong within our deep ancestry. Others may have watched unfamiliar humans enter their landscapes before disappearing into populations we cannot identify. Their legacy is a human world already complex long before our species appeared. And so the last confirmed skulls at Ngandong do not close a straight line. They close only the visible record of one late population. Behind them lies a chain of missing valleys, drowned plains, unexcavated caves, and bodies never fossilized. Ahead lies the possibility that traces survive in proteins, in unnamed island lineages, or in genetic fragments not yet recognized. Homo erectus ends in mystery, because the evidence preserves presence far better than transformation. It can show us where these humans stood. It cannot always tell us what they became. Beyond the last river terrace, the scale of time begins to soften every boundary. A skull loses its face. A tool loses the hand that shaped it. A footprint keeps the pressure of one step while the walker, the shoreline, and even the species name disappear. What remains is enough to prove that lives were lived there, but rarely enough to recover their full meaning. For nearly 2 million years, different humans carried this broad lineage through grasslands, forests, volcanic valleys, cold northern basins, and islands reached across uncertain water. They learned routes that no map recorded. They recognized companions whose names are gone. They returned to springs, stone outcrops, caves, and river bends until climate or chance made those places unfamiliar. Their world was not a rehearsal for ours. It was complete while it lasted. Somewhere in that darkness, ordinary moments remain beyond recovery, a path chosen at dawn, a sharp flake passed between hands, embers protected from rain, quiet attention beside water. These were not milestones to those who lived them. They were simply ways of continuing, repeated until continuation was no longer possible. Modern humanity often imagines permanence because memory reaches only a few generations with clarity. The fossil record offers a colder perspective. A lineage can survive longer than mountains keep their shape and still fade until only fragments remain. Success does not guarantee continuation. Disappearance does not mean insignificance. Every population exists within conditions it did not choose, carrying knowledge that may endure, change, or vanish when the chain of learning breaks. The name Homo erectus gathers these distant lives into one phrase, but the phrase is only a lantern held over darkness. Around its edge are populations not yet discovered, migrations hidden beneath seas, and relationships that future molecules may reveal. Perhaps new fossils will divide the lineage further. Perhaps proteins or DNA will connect forms now kept apart. The story will change because it has always been larger than the evidence available at any one moment. For now, the Solo River moves through Java beneath a different sky. Far below old terraces, water passes sediment laid down when another kind of human watched the same valley. Nothing announces where the final group went or when the last familiar face was gone. There is only the river, carrying the landscape forward, and behind it the long human shadow of a lineage that crossed continents, endured worlds, and left its ending unwritten beneath the stars.